a number of interesting compounds that have been tested in type 1 diabetes at onset. In particular, the so-called specific and non-specific immune intervention, specific using GARD or insulin or other antigens that are the target of an autoimmune response in type 1 diabetes, and other non-specific or immunoregulatory agents like the anti-CD3 monoclonal antibody, the anti-CD20, or the CTLA-4. As Des Schatz mentioned before, some of these results were disappointing, other results were slightly beneficial, and of course, again, the whole community of diabetologists working in type 1 diabetes are looking into this new data to try to find inspiration for future studies. The results, even the last paper that we published this week, 2 weeks ago in the Lancet, about the anti-IL-1 receptor agonist, the Anakinra, that was used as part of an anti-inflammatory process involving type 1 diabetes and tackling the inflammation, was negative. As Des mentioned before, there were 2 or 3 studies showing some interesting data, but again, the C-peptide was slightly increased, and we didn't see any real strong effect in terms of changing the natural history. Because this is what we like to do. We like to change the natural history within the first few years. And we know what's happened in the first few years. We have to change that. And I always try to say to my patients that when we have some C-peptide left and patients are diagnosed with significant C-peptide, I say, well, try to slightly change the direction where you go. Keep even a 10% beta cell function more than what you could expect. And I give you the example of a sailing boat that if you, of course in Italy we say from Rome to Sardinia, and you go to a beautiful place in Sardinia, but if you change the route by 10 degrees, you don't reach Porto Cervo. You go somewhere else. So I think it's important to consider that even a small change in the natural history of type 1 diabetes could be very beneficial, because from the DCCT we know that prevention of complication may be bound to the preservation of beta cell function. So then I think that in terms of considering new approaches, we know that it's important the combination therapy. And now we know that what we learned from cyclosporine was extremely useful, in particular because we know now that the long-term adverse effect of cyclosporine at the dose that was used were not present. And of course this is very valuable if we know that the current agents, we do not know about long-term adverse effects. These agents have been recently introduced, and of course we need to keep safety as primum non nocere, as the first outcome of our studies. So the long-term renal toxicity of cyclosporine can be taken away now, and the combination of two drugs using an immunotolerance agent with a beta cell regenerating compound should be definitely taken into account as a potential therapy. But we have to remember, and I think this is significant when you design a study to prevent type 1 diabetes, that type 1 diabetes is an autoimmune disease that extends across all ages and varies with age at diagnosis. You cannot compare easily a type 1 diabetic diagnosed pre-puberty or after puberty or in an adult, because the mass of beta cell function at diagnosis is different between the progression towards the complete loss of beta cell function differs between age groups, and adolescence is a very critical time because of insulin resistance associated with autoimmunity, and also because the problem today of obesity in young children can actually create an additional problem to these newly diagnosed patients, because they are also insulin resistant, and that could speed up the destruction of the beta cell. So there are a number of factors that need to be taken into account for future studies. And I think that there are 4 issues that we need to take into account now for this new study. First of all, the C-peptide levels. In yellow there, the C-peptide levels at diagnosis represent an important marker where we start. Then the dose of the drug we're going to use, the duration of the disease. This is another important parameter, because if we keep on the C-peptide as a good marker, we have to take into account that patient may still have a preserved C-peptide even after a few months or even a couple of years from diagnosis. They don't lose the C-peptide. So if the C-peptide is still there, maybe potential target for therapy. And finally, the age, because the age is related to the C-peptide diagnosis. We know that children tend to lose their beta cell mass faster than earlier and faster than adults. And so my last slide is that in the future direction we are thinking of the combination therapy should certainly look at the protection of the residual beta cell function, try to keep that beta cell that are still alive when you diagnose a child or a young patient with type 1 diabetes, and at the same time try to keep the beta cell to regenerate as much as you can, because the two combinations, the two systems, the two mechanisms could be tackled easily with the current drugs available.